It's now my great pleasure to introduce Shibley Telhami, the Anwar Sadat Professor for Peace and Development at the University of Maryland in College Park. Shibley Telhami, as I said, is the Anwar Sadat Professor for Peace and Development. He was selected by the Carnegie Corporation of New York with the New York Times as one of the great immigrants for 2013 for his work in both governmental and non-governmental capacities. Professor Telhami served as advisor to the U.S. mission to the UN in the early 1990s before going on to advise Congressman Lee Hamilton, Special Envoy for the Middle East Peace, George Mitchell, and the U.S. State Department. He also works as a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution's Saban Center and is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. His best-selling book, The Stakes, America and the Middle East, from 2003-2004, was selected by Foreign Affairs as one of the top 5 books on the Middle East in that year. His other publications include Power and Leadership in International Bargaining, The Path to Camp David Accords, 1990, International Organizations and Ethnic Conflict with Milton Essman, 1995, Identity and Foreign Policy in the Middle East with Michael Barnett, The Sadat Lectures, Words and Images on Peace, 1997-2008, The Peace Puzzle, America's Quest for Arab-Israeli Peace, 1989-2011, co-authored with Dan Kurtzer in 2013, and The World Through Arab Eyes, Arab Public Opinion and the Reshaping of the Middle East this past year. Numerous articles on international politics and Middle Eastern affairs. He has been a principal investigator in the annual Arab Public Opinion Survey conducted since 2002 in 6 Arab countries. It is my pleasure to introduce Shibley Telhami.
Thanks so much. It's really a great pleasure for me to be here. I was always interested in speaking to high school teachers because I think it's one of the most important group really in reaching students as they're forming. And I know that we live in an interdependent world, and I watch. My son just graduated from high school, started college this year. We've been very involved in our high school. And have supported, they have an IB program that we've supported, and international trips that they've been sponsoring that we've been very enthusiastic about and supporting financially as well. So this is really something that I see as part of a mission to reach to a lot of young Americans who need to know more about the world, and certainly this region that I specialize in the Middle East. Obviously, my subject is so broad that we could take a year to cover the history of the peace process. So I don't intend to be comprehensive. I intend to give you some highlights and make some points that bring us to where we are now. In some ways, a depressing place to be because we don't really even have a peace process, and people now frown on even the idea of a peace process as something that is intended only to buy time so that we don't have real peace. And so you have all kinds of moral arguments pertaining even to the notion of a peace process right now, and certainly more people pessimistic than optimistic. In fact, now in my polling, I poll among Israelis, among Palestinians, and also among Arabs outside of the Palestinian territories. And what I find is that now a majority of every single group think that peace will never happen. It's not just that it's not going to happen soon, but it will never happen. And so we have a real problem on our hands in terms of certainly the two-state solution that has been put forth as the principal aim of diplomacy as a solution for the Israel-Palestine question is coming toward the end of the road, where few people believe it's going to happen. And it's going to leave us in a place we don't want to go in some ways. In fact, I'll come back to that as why we don't want to go there, why people are terrified of the alternatives, which is what keeps it going. But I'm going to go back a little bit in history to be faithful to the mandate that I was given this morning. And so if you look at the history of diplomacy and peace efforts on the Israel-Palestine on the Israel-Arab front broadly, not just the Israel-Palestine front, 2 wars really frame this question better than any other. 2 wars are in some ways ones that have opened up the possibility of diplomatic effort toward resolving the Israeli-Arab conflict, and those are the 1967 and the 1973 war. Those were extremely important in framing the desire and the necessity for a peaceful solution, and also in framing American diplomacy toward the Israeli-Arab conflict. Let me just briefly say why. The 67 war was a huge war between Israel and its neighbors that resulted in an impressive Israeli victory that led to not only the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, but also to Egyptian territories, the Sinai Peninsula, all the way to the Suez Canal, and Syrian territory, the Golan Heights. And separate from the occupation itself and what it did, there was a degree of realism in the Arab world that came out of it. There's no question that from 1948 to 1967, at least at the public level, I mean, governments really varied in their outlook on Israel, but at the public level, there was no question that Israel was seen as a temporary historical entity, that it was bound to disappear, and obviously the term Israel wasn't even used in the discourse, it was just the temporary Zionist entity. The war was expected to result in an Arab victory, particularly at a time when you had an ascendant Egypt with Arab nationalism, and it was quite exactly the opposite. It was a devastating and humiliating defeat. And with that, there was a creeping realism in the Arab world that they're going to have to that Israel may not be as temporary as they had assumed, that they're going to have to reach some accommodation with it. And this is separate also from the fact they had to find a way to get their territories back, particularly Egypt, because Israel now had real levers. So 67 was extremely important on the Arab side of the equation in terms of the realism. It also was important because this was the transition in some ways in the sponsorship of Israel from Europe to the United States. This is the period when the Europeans are essentially disengaging from the Middle East. The Brits are withdrawing from the Gulf. The French are really, by the way, the French had been the major military backer of Israel all the way until 67. And they decided they're going to pull out because their interests were changing, particularly after the 67 war. And the US was filling in the vacuum, was moving in essentially to back Israel as the principal military backer of Israel. The US always backed Israel politically and financially, but this clearly created a new vacuum where the US moved in far more aggressively as the principal backer of Israel. And the 73 war, which took place, just 6 years after, created a bit of realism on the Israeli side, and a bit of realism on the American side, because up until 73, the Israelis really had assumed that they were so superior militarily, that the Arabs were so soundly defeated, that they weren't going to be able to recover anytime soon to fight the Israelis. No one really expected the Egyptians and the Syrians to launch the war when they did in 73, and no one expected them to perform as well as they did in 1973. And with that, I think that kind of attitude the Israelis had after 67 pretty much disappeared. There was a new sense of urgency, a new sense of realism, a new sense of that something diplomatic needs to be done, whether it's in the short term or the long term. But it also did something to the US, because the US was roughly in the same space as Israel in terms of their sense after 67 that the Arabs simply are not in a position to threaten Israel. Israel is superior. They had no incentive to reach out to the Arab side. They had no incentive to encourage even diplomacy that wanted to find some common ground. The US did intervene in those years in the so-called Rogers Plan 1970, but really the Nixon administration wasn't very much behind it. Henry Kissinger ultimately was reluctant even to respond to Anwar Sadat, the new president of Egypt in 1970, when he reached out trying to reach an accommodation, because he didn't take him seriously. He had no incentive. It didn't seem like a priority. He didn't respond to him when he made gestures to him. And the U.S. didn't expect the Arabs to launch the war. And even more than that, they expected that if they launched the war, they would be soundly defeated. Well, they weren't. And as a result, the U.S. itself found itself in a remarkably tight spot in '73, not only in terms of its tension with the Soviet Union, that was only one aspect of it, but more importantly, a major strain among America's interest in the Middle East. And this is something that we have to think about a little bit because you have to understand the kind of how American diplomacy viewed Arab-Israeli peace historically. In '73, there's a profound change in the way America starts defining its interest vis-a-vis the Arab-Israeli peace process. Why? Because here is a war in which the U.S. not only finding itself in a position trying to prevent escalation in a way that would draw it into confrontation with the Soviet Union, but more importantly, on the one hand, it is now Israel's main backer and certainly wants to protect Israeli interests and wants to support Israel wholeheartedly. On the other hand, the '73 war generated the Arab oil embargo. And we faced here, you know, the lines to gas stations, the quadrupling of oil prices globally. And so, and most of it, at least politically, was connected to the Arab-Israeli issue. The Arabs essentially mobilized to say, unless you force Israel to withdraw from the territories occupied in '67, we're going to wage an economic war. And so what we had in that period is this tension. Here's the United States, which had defined its interests, on the one hand, support for Israel and its security and survival, on the other hand, economic interests, particularly the flow of oil to the West at reasonable prices, and they come in conflict directly. And so how does the U.S. resolve this? How does the U.S. deal with this tension in those two important interests for the United States in the Middle East? And essentially, the U.S. says, the only way for us to do it is to find a way to mediate between the two to reduce the conflict. And from that point on, actually, you can argue that it became an axiom of American foreign policy that Arab-Israeli peace is an American interest. Because the only way you can reduce the tension between the commitment to Israel on the one hand and America's interest in the Arab world on the other is by reducing the tension on the Israel-Arab front. So that's really what created American active diplomacy in the pursuit of resolving the Arab-Israeli conflict. And you find during that period the famous Henry Kissinger shuttle diplomacy going between Egypt and Israel and Syria, trying to arrange for ceasefires and disengagement agreements that most certainly, at least for the interim period, reduced the chance of revived military conflict. And laid down the seeds for what came a few years later, and that is the Camp David agreements between Israel and Egypt. Now, just a couple of things before I say a few words about Camp David, because obviously it's the most, arguably the most important agreement between Israel and the Arab states to date that have framed much of diplomacy since that period. But I want to say, separate from the Kissinger success in negotiating disengagement agreements, clearly that crisis of the '73 war was not utilized to resolve the conflict. And to this day, there's a whole debate about whether that crisis, that is Israel's insecurity and the pressure, the political mobilization behind the President of the United States to do something, whether that should have been exploited to have something more comprehensive. And those who say that wasn't possible, so the best thing you could do is just have ceasefire agreements to make it not, to delay the possibility of revived conflict. There's a debate, but obviously the Nixon administration didn't last long, and it was followed by the Carter administration, which inherited essentially this assumption that Arab-Israeli peace is an American interest, and certainly Jimmy Carter came with that, and the people who came with him, both Zbigniew Brzezinski and on the Middle East, William Quandt, who was the staffer at the NSC, they came in believing that wholeheartedly coming out of that 74 war. But the initial impetus for diplomacy wasn't really to have bilateral agreements between Egypt and Israel. So following those so-called disengagement agreements, we found there was a process called the Geneva Conference, which was intended to have a comprehensive deal where Israel would negotiate essentially with the Arab states, including Egypt. And that process wasn't getting anywhere, in part because the Israelis were uncomfortable with it, in part because there were disagreements on who would represent the Palestinians, or even if the Israelis would recognize the Palestinians, and in part because it's very, very difficult to have a negotiation with multiple Arab parties who don't necessarily see eye to eye. I mean, we talk of the Arab world, but as we have discovered, of course, Egypt and Saudi Arabia and Syria and Jordan and Morocco don't necessarily have all the same interests or even the same priorities or the same urgency in dealing with the issue. So while in principle that seemed like a good idea, the probability that was going to succeed was very small. But that's the track that was taken, really beginning with Henry Kissinger and through the early Carter administration. So the main breakthrough comes when you have Anwar Sadat, the president of Egypt, declare that he was prepared to break the deadlock and go to Jerusalem. And I know some of you, maybe old enough. I see a few ones who are, sort of my age or, up there who would remember those, how unbelievable that moment was in historical perspective. But separate from that, if you look at it, Egypt had been Israel's main enemy, never accepted Israel, fought the 1948 war, the 1956 war, the 1967 war, the 1973 war, the war of attrition in between. It was a dramatic move by the president of Egypt to essentially accept Israel and go on and give a speech at the Israeli Knesset. Created something that we had never seen before, and certainly was invited by the Prime Minister of Israel, Menachem Begin, to visit Israel to deliver that. And to this day, by the way, there is a whole debate among those of us who study peace and peace efforts and conflict resolution about this kind of shock diplomacy, the transformation of expectations, the breaking of the barriers, the creation of new expectations, the psychological effort that is necessary to create new opportunities that otherwise don't exist before. So there's a whole debate about whether this is really something that you need on occasions, particularly when you don't see a way out. But regardless, it certainly reshuffled the deck in the Middle East. And with it, there was certainly an American embrace of the effort to have Egyptian-Israeli peace. And by the way, the US was consulted even before Sadat went to Jerusalem, so this didn't come totally out of the dark. And Carter, gave his support to the president of Egypt to pursue this particular path. And when you look at it, and the commencement of the negotiations that ultimately led to the Camp David negotiations, I have to reflect on some things that are critical, particularly for people who say, here was a set of negotiations between Israel and the Arabs that succeeded, and it was successful. We ended up with an agreement that really has lasted even despite the Egyptian revolution, despite the fact that we had a Muslim Brotherhood president elected, and despite the fact that we had him overthrown. It has lasted through all of this, and it's quite remarkable that it has lasted, and it has framed really changed the distribution of power in ways that cannot be ignored. And on contrast that with the other Camp David negotiations in 2000, when Bill Clinton tried to mediate between Israel and the Palestinians, in an intense conference partly intended to emulate the Camp David agreements between Egypt and Israel, and failed so miserably that it really had a devastating consequence for a whole decade that we're still suffering from. And in fact, part of the reason why people no longer believe is that collapse of those negotiations after people came to believe that this is possible. But I want to say something about that comparison, historical perspective. We often focus on, leaders and, systems of government, negotiating styles, all of which are very important. I'll address them briefly. But what we sometimes ignore is the strategic context in which these things take place. And sometimes that strategic context is so central in determining the prospects of success and failure. And whatever you say of Anwar Sadat, Anwar Sadat wanted to get his territory back and wanted his Egypt to improve. He wasn't doing it simply because he loved peace. He was a man who wanted to advance the interests of his country. And Anwar Sadat, for one thing, was the president who risked disaster in 1973 to wage a war that nobody thought he could win in order to change the strategic circumstances. So it's the same man who waged that surprise war in 73 who's now waging the battle of peace. So it isn't, these are all instruments obviously to advance interests, but when you look at it in historical perspective and you see what essentially defined that move and why was American diplomacy successful, you can't divorce that from the strategic global context. This was a time when the United States desperately needed an agreement with Egypt, separate from the Israeli-Egyptian treaty, because they wanted to rob the Soviet Union, their key ally in the Middle East, and with it transform America's influence in the region. So the U.S. had a real interest, and obviously the U.S., coming out of the 73 war and what it witnessed, wanted to resolve that tension to the extent possible to be able to move forward. So there was an American interest. That American interest was very much nested in the Cold War. This was a time when America cared about the region far more than it came to care about in the 1990s after the end of the Cold War. So in some ways, America's interests were central in that period. And second, in part because the U.S. had real interest, strategic interest, in seeing an agreement, it was also a little more even-handed in mediating between Israel and Egypt. Not because it was less supportive of Israel, the U.S. was still supportive of Israel, but because it had to take into account what Egypt wanted, because Egypt had lever. Egypt certainly had more lever with Israel than the Palestinians ever did down the road, because Egypt was a big country with a major military power that could fight a credible war. But separate from that, Egypt had far more weight with the United States, given that the bilateral agreement was important. In fact, interestingly, Israeli Defense Minister Ezer Weizman at that time wrote in his memoirs that he was extremely worried about Camp David because he believed that Egyptian and American interests were closer to each other than Israeli and American interests at that time, and that Israel may be cornered and pressured by a combination of Egypt and the U.S. Exactly the opposite, by the way, of 2000, when the Palestinians feared going to the Camp David negotiations because they thought that Ehud Barak, the Prime Minister of Israel, and Bill Clinton were seeing eye to eye, and they would be cornered in those negotiations. It was a very, very different kind of configuration. And with that, I would argue, and I have argued in my book, The Path to the Camp David Accords, that one of the main things that was driving Sadat, sure, he wanted to get his territory back and make peace with Israel, but above all, he actually thought that history was on America's side, and he wanted to consolidate his strategic relationship with the United States. He thought that was his vehicle to enhancing Egyptian power. And therefore, he was prepared to go to Camp David and was prepared to fail at Camp David at reaching an accommodation with Menachem Begin, as long as he was able to leave having consolidated his relationship with the United States at the expense of Israel. He was perfectly prepared to do that. And you can argue that was exactly also what Menachem Begin believed. Menachem Begin sure wanted an agreement with Egypt, but above all, he wanted to preserve the relationship with the US. And we found that at Camp David, Jimmy Carter understood that very well. And now, just in the past few months, we've had new documents released from the Camp David era that reinforce that, where Jimmy Carter, people thought of him as kind of a light on foreign policy, shows how heavy he was actually on foreign policy, how tough he was, how prepared he was to play the cards that he needed to play to get the parties to go. So when Menachem Begin was seen not to be compromising, Jimmy Carter said, if you don't compromise, particularly on settlements on the Sinai, and we end up failing, then I'm going to go to the American people and say, you, the Prime Minister of Israel, is the main reason the negotiations failed. And they actually prepared a speech to do so. And then later, when Anwar Sadat packed his bags in an attempt to leave and declare failure of the negotiations, Jimmy Carter went to his cabinet and said, if you pack and leave now, I'm going to go to the American people and tell them you were the reason that we failed. And they both stayed, and they had an agreement. So I want to put that in context and put that in contrast with what happened at Camp David 2000, when Bill Clinton brought the Israelis and the Palestinians together trying to reach an agreement, where Bill Clinton essentially, if you put that in historical perspective, you'd understand it. Bill Clinton comes in after we'd already won the Cold War. It's over. It's an era of Pax Americana. We had won the 1991 Iraq War. Everybody says we're the only superpower in the world. We're economically ascendant. We're leading a globalization revolution that's good for America and everyone else. And he comes in and says, it's the economy, stupid. Who cares about what's happening in foreign affairs? If you recall, go back into history and see how Bill Clinton beat George Bush. It was all about the economy. I'm going to focus on domestic. Who cares about global? Look at the debates that we've had during that whole period about what is American foreign policy going to be like in Bill Clinton's era? It was all domestic politics. People thought, it's going to be a foreign policy driven by domestic politics, because who cares? We don't have strategic interests. And the fascinating thing is that Bill Clinton actually didn't particularly care about the Israel-Palestine question. He did care about supporters of Israel who were part of a very important constituency for him domestically, for sure. But this was not an issue that was high on his agenda. And you can even see his pronouncements in the very first few months in office angered a lot of Arabs for essentially ignoring it. And really didn't respond to it until the Israelis and Palestinians secretly reached out to each other and concluded the Oslo agreements in 1993, and then came to him and said, could you sponsor this? Here's something we're handing you. And he did it even more because he thought the Israelis wanted it. And it was a nice opportunity, but not because it was so much strategically important for the United States of America. And in the research that we've done in the most recent book that we just published with Dan Kurtzer, Steve Spiegel, and William Quant, that the Peace Puzzle, America's Quest for Arab-Israeli Peace, 1989 to 2011, we've gone into archival materials and we interviewed most of the principals on the American side, the Arab side, Egyptians, Jordanians, Syrians, and Palestinians, and also the Israeli side, trying to piece together what happened at Camp David. And there's no question in my own mind that while there are failings of the Palestinians and the Israelis, that part of the problem for the United States was that Bill Clinton from day one, as much as he came to want to see an Arab-Israeli peace, he wanted to see it principally as a humanitarian gesture, as part of the legacy, as part of something that a big constituency wanted, not as a principal strategic interest of the United States. And we found that in it, and therefore he didn't have the preparation that are typically required of something that is so important. We found that the way he behaved toward the end in terms of how it was declared, it was very little consultation, very little interagency coordination, that only typical of issues that you don't rank very high in the strategic priority. And that's not the principal reason for failure, but certainly one that contributed to it, and that's something that we see. So the strategic environment matters a lot, and I just wanted to give you that contrast. Let me just make a couple of more points related to the peace process. Now, you know, I already mentioned that the Camp David Accords were extraordinary, that they were successful from the point of view of the Israelis and the Egyptians, that they transformed strategic priorities, that they reshuffled the deck in the Middle East, that they've reshaped the distribution of power, that they've essentially reduced the chance of major Arab-Israeli war a lot, because Egypt was certainly the most effective Arab party in any conceivable war. And yet they also had their other side effect. For one thing, what was hoped to be part of a bigger project where we'd draw other Arab countries into it, at least in the immediate aftermath of Camp David, it was quite the opposite. Egypt was thrown out of the Arab League. Even the Saudis, who were its close ally, abandoned Egypt, and Egypt was seen to have essentially betrayed the Arabs. And in that sense, it hardened Arab positions, and we had what emerged as the Arab rejection front, essentially rejection at Camp David. And so it hardened Arab positions. On the Israeli side, it also hardened Israeli positions because it reduced the incentive to compromise on the West Bank, which was really the cornerstone of any long-term peace with the Arab states. And the Israelis consequently grew accustomed to it, to holding on to the West Bank in a way that goes even beyond the fact that we had settlements built. And to make things worse, to the extent that there was a failure at Camp David, Camp David certainly was principally a bilateral agreement between Egypt and Israel, but there was also an autonomy agreement that was produced for the Palestinians at Camp David, and there was absolutely no linkage between the two. So while there was a short-term agreement on a settlement freeze that was disputed by the Israelis and the Americans, certainly the long-term effect is there was no agreement on a long-term settlement freeze in the West Bank. There was no linkage to say normalization between Egypt and Israel is linked to what happens on the Palestinian front. So that absence of linkage created no incentive for additional peaceful move. And the Israeli incentive really didn't start until, once again, just like in '73, you have a war that shakes up the Israelis, until you had the first Intifada in 1987, the Palestinian uprising, when the Palestinians were fed up with occupation and didn't see diplomacy to resolve it, took things into their own hands, and again created more incentive for diplomacy that emerged. That incentive didn't pay off immediately, in part because the whole international community was facing major change. The Cold War coming to an end, the Iraq-Iran war was coming to an end, and then suddenly Iraq invades Kuwait in 1990, and we have a whole new set of issues that come with it. But that Iraq-Iran war and the subsequent American-led intervention to dislodge Iraq from Kuwait in 1991 was very much linked to the peace process on the Arab-Israeli front. Because what the US discovered during that war is that once again, the Israeli-Palestine question complicated America's attempt to build a coalition against Iraq. So, for example, the U.S. Initially thought time would be on America's side by imposing sanctions and waiting before it fought a war with Iraq. But it found that in that interim, when sanctions are being imposed on Iraq, the Palestinians were accusing the U.S. of double standards on the West Bank and Jerusalem particularly, and eruptions in Jerusalem led to UN action that almost derailed the American diplomatic efforts in August 1990 and September 1990, so that it became problematic to wait. The U.S. had to, in some ways, partly accelerate the timetable of the war because of that. And second, when the U.S. went to Europeans and Arabs and said to them, join us to dislodge Iraq from Kuwait, they said, on the one condition that right after the war, you then start genuine effort to resolve the Israel-Palestine question. And that really led to the so-called Madrid conference that was put together by the Bush administration through the effort of Secretary of State James Baker in Madrid, Spain, trying to bring Arabs and Israelis together. That was a major breakthrough. And it was a major breakthrough even though it didn't lead to any real diplomatic success per se. The very fact that you had the actors that were brought together to meet with the Israelis was major. And the fact that you brought the Israelis to it was a major success, because at the time, Israel had a very right-wing government led by Yitzhak Shamir, who clearly didn't want to go into a negotiated settlement. And the Bush administration, coming strong out of the Iraq war, had enough lever to essentially manipulate him into going to Madrid. But also, on the Arab front, the Syrians, who had rejected negotiating with the Israelis, who had participated in the 1991 war with the US, were brought in to talk to the Israelis. And finally, the Palestinians, the Israelis didn't want to talk to the Palestinians as an independent entity, but they acquiesced in Palestinian participation within the Jordanian delegation. And that really became ultimately the avenue for real Israeli-Palestinian negotiations, even though it was not formalized at Madrid. So we had a process that was underway during that period prior to the 1993 Oslo breakthrough that was negotiated secretly. But the Madrid conference ultimately didn't succeed for two reasons. One is you had a change of administration. Bush started that. Clinton comes, and I said Clinton's priorities were really domestic. He continued the Madrid process, but he wasn't paying a lot of attention to it. And second, the Palestinian representation was a major issue, because as the Israelis later said, we were essentially negotiating with the PLO by fax, because even though they were talking to individual Palestinians that were acceptable to them within the Jordanian delegation, all these Palestinians would go in the evening and they would fax the notes to the PLO in Tunis and say, what should we do? And the PLO would fax them back what to do. And they said, well, if we have to do that, why don't we talk to the PLO directly? And so the Oslo agreements really were born out of that environment, where the Israelis negotiated secretly with the Palestinians in what came to be known as the Oslo agreements. I'm just going to say a couple of things about that before I just bring it back to more recent days and then end. When you look at those Oslo agreements, I don't think anyone at the time or since has looked at them and said those are brilliantly negotiated agreements. In fact, everybody I know who does negotiations on every side of it, Israeli or Palestinian, observer, doesn't matter, said these are lousy agreements. And they were lousy agreements. They had too many holes in them. And so as an agreement, they were not a very, very good agreement as agreements go. And I'll just give a couple of examples in a minute. But they were hugely important because what we had in these agreements wasn't really the content. The content was, yes, important and ultimately detrimental, actually. But the breakthrough was the psychological breakthrough. It was just like when Sadat went to Jerusalem. What you suddenly had is the mutual recognition for the first time of Israel and the Palestinians. I mean, here's the chairman of the Palestine Liberation Organization writing a letter to Yitzhak Rabin, the Prime Minister of Israel, acknowledging Israel. And the Prime Minister of Israel writing a letter to the chairman of the Palestine Liberation Organization that he considered before that as a terrorist organization, saying essentially, we accept you as the representative of the Palestinian people. So there was a kind of a mutual recognition that emerged that really framed the future negotiations. And that recognition was important not only as a breakthrough that kind of defined new opportunities, but it was also important psychologically across the board. I happened to be there at the White House, on the White House lawn when Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat shook hands with Bill Clinton's mediation. It was an extraordinary moment. And those images mattered a lot. And if you look at that whole decade of the 1990s, and you see the sentiment, even people who didn't like the accords, even people who disagreed with them, even people who thought they were lousy, most of them thought peace was inevitable. If I were to ask people in 1994 or 1996, and even after Rabin's assassination, what do you think the prospect of peace between Israel and Palestinians is? I think you'd had a majority say it's going to happen within a few years, whether they liked it or not. There was a whole kind of, expectation that framed then the interests of everybody to want to be on the winning side of the equation, not on the losing side of the equation. It's quite different since the failure of Camp David in 2000, when people are betting that they're going to fail, and no one wants to be stupid enough to make concessions they're going to come to regret. And so you don't make concessions. And so very different environment that this psychology created. So one more reference to the Oslo agreements. One of the problems with the Oslo agreements, I think, was the incremental nature of the agreement. It was thought that there would be incremental measures that would lead to confidence building. It was quite the opposite, because that delay in reaching an agreement only gave time to opponents who wanted to derail it. And moreover, the fact that the Oslo agreements postponed all the major issues, say we'll deal with them later, Jerusalem, borders, settlements, Israeli security, everything, postponed it till the very end, it meant that nobody wants to make a compromise in the interim and pay a political price while they know there's a bigger political price to be paid up, when they get to the final status. And so it created a mood where people were reluctant to make concessions on both sides. And that was particularly true of Ehud Barak when he became a prime minister, and that became self-defeating. We saw it in the process, part of the reason why these negotiations failed. Let me just finally come to just a couple of comments about the Obama administration, where we are now, and then I'll open it for questions. I happened to advise the Obama administration the first couple of years on this issue. And I know that Obama came to office thinking this is a priority issue for him, that it's important for America. And you can see he appointed George Mitchell almost in day one as one of the priorities for the administration. And we know how miserably diplomacy has failed in getting there. And I'm just going to give you my very brief assessment of why it failed. One reason it failed is I don't know that the president ever internalized what he was saying about a priority issue, meaning you have to pay a price, and he didn't demonstrate he was prepared to pay a price. Number two, really problematic Israeli and Palestinian politics. Palestine is divided between Hamas and Fatah, West Bank and Gaza. And Obama comes in and Netanyahu gets elected and you have a right-wing government, many members of which don't even want a two-state solution. And so you have broken Palestinian-Israeli politics. And finally, the Arab uprisings. So he comes in, and within a year or so, you have less than a year actually, by the end of 2000, a little more than a year. You have the outbreak of the Arab uprisings that clearly transformed the political priorities and made it hard for him to deal with. And so where are we now? I think I told you already where the publics are. People just don't believe that it's going to happen. And that's devastating because that means no one has patience for compromise. You need to make people believe it could happen if you want to compromise. And that's not there. Second, Arabs are preoccupied with the Arab uprisings right now. So while this issue is central to them in some ways, it isn't right now the central issue either for Egypt or Jordan or Syria or anybody else. Everybody's preoccupied with their things. Third, this administration is certainly preoccupied with more than it could deal with, and globally, but even in the Middle East, it has major issues that it is dealing with, particularly ISIS. And yet, I think there's a kind of an interesting situation where the Secretary of State still thinks that he might have an opportunity to move forward before the end of the administration, and really a sense that the president himself, despite where his staffers are, thinks that this still is a central issue to the U.S., that he might want to take one more stab at it before he leaves office. And while I think that the old strategy may be gone, at some point, the entire Obama administration strategy was, if you persuade Benjamin Netanyahu that he should make a deal, then he can make everything happen. And if you don't persuade him, you fail. It was a one-man strategy. And right now, they've reached a conclusion they may not be able to persuade him. So what they're considering, of course, is something about putting a plan on the table and then seeing whether that could work. Well, history of that is it hasn't worked very well. And whether or not there's a chance for it now is something to be seen. So where does that leave us? It leaves us where, I'm historically an optimist. But I can tell you that this is the time that I'm least optimistic in all of the years that I've been dealing with the Arab-Israeli conflict. And that attitude is certainly derived from the reality on the ground and from the public sentiment that I see across the board. But I am, at another level, I'm far more reflective on this than just limiting myself to using the tools of my discipline to make an assessment. Because frankly, my field and every field, whether it's political science or social science or analyst, we have failed historically to predict almost every breakthrough in history. And if you look at what happened whether it's war or peace, whether it was the end of the Cold War or the '73 Arab-Israeli War or the Camp David Accords or the Oslo Accords, I invite you to look back the months before, people saying it's never going to happen, it's the worst thing that has ever happened, and suddenly we have a transformation because frankly, we are trained to predict the future based on the past. What is science? Science is identifying the patterns of the past and applying them to the future. That's exactly what we do in science. And yet change is exactly the break from the past. And so the fact that it doesn't look good right now doesn't mean it's not going to happen. And if you want to interpret that as optimism, I'll end with that. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. I did want to add that FPRI did predict the ending of the Cold War several years before it ended, but
Thank you very much for a wonderful talk. I have two questions for you. One has to do with this issue that you were talking about, pre-peace between Egypt and Israel. You talked about factors of the men involved, and then you talked about external factors, and in particular, kind of bidding for United States' favor. And so I'm curious if you could talk a little bit more about the collapse of U.S.-Soviet relations that also sort of facilitated this, and the economic factors in Egypt, which also facilitated Sadat's need to sort of reposition himself. And then the second question is, in the pre-Arab uprising period, there was a little bit of talk of the nature of the cold peace between Egypt and Israel. So of course you have military cooperation or intelligence cooperation, and you have peace, but you don't have vibrant travel and exchange and trade. And people were asking, does it matter? So I'm just curious, does it matter?
Well, that's an interesting question about does it matter. Let me start with that, because that's something that has been discussed and I think not quite fully understood. Now, the cold peace, first of all, between Israel and Egypt is not as hard to understand as people think. And that is, I think, from the Egyptian narrative point of view, the Camp David Accords were not bilateral. Legally, they were bilateral. There was no linkage between them. But the way the Egyptian government sold it to the public, and the way the Egyptian narrative takes it, is that there were two parts to Camp David: Palestinian autonomy leading to independence, and a bilateral Israeli-Egyptian treaty. The Egyptians lived up to their bargain on the peace, and the Israelis haven't lived up to the Palestine question, and there's anger. And I would even say, in some ways, overcompensation, because we find the anger in Egypt is a little higher than the rest of the Arab world historically, because of a sense of guilt, the way they bring it in. So I think that's part of it. Now, does it matter is a good question. I happen to think that, of course, it does over the long haul for consolidated relations. But the oddity of it is that people who say the way to win, to make peace, is to bring these bridges and so forth among people. I think building bridges is good in itself for a variety of reasons, not for multiple reasons, have nothing to do with peace agreements. But as a way of bringing peace agreements, I don't have faith in that. Why? Because I look at what happened. I mean, you look at the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty, there was no preparation. There was no preparation at all. The public wasn't prepared, neither the Egyptian public nor the Israeli public, and boom, it just happened. And it worked, and it was actually the agreement that is more solid. So you don't need that necessarily. You might want to need it later to build in, but that's not the case. Moreover, in my new book, The World Through Arab Eyes, I have a chapter on empathy and incitement. And one of the things that I tried to measure is whether these forms of understanding can actually enhance the prospects of an agreement. And what I found is that actually it can be quite the opposite. Not because they can't help, but because what happens is that empathy itself is a function of whether you believe war is going to happen or peace is going to happen. If you think war is going to happen, you don't want to empathize. You're going to have to fight the other side. And if you empathize, you're weak. You can't, you're disarmed. You can't afford it. If you think there's peace, you open up. You're prepared to empathize. You start wanting to understand. So we see that happening, for example, after Oslo, where there was a lot more opening to each other and interaction. And people who go through these training sessions for understanding, like let's say on the Palestinian side, we've done a poll, then when they make an assessment that war is going to happen and there's been no change and they've been doing it for 20 years, they say, we're being used. They're trying to disarm us. And because look at and therefore they react and they overcompensate. So we find quite the opposite than what people think on that. Now, on Camp David, of course, it's a big, complicated story. Of course, the economy was an issue for Egypt, and there were many other reasons. It wasn't just the American issue. But I tackled that in my first book on Camp David, in which, my argument is that Egypt essentially saw itself as leading the Arab world. It still does. They see that it's their legacy, their history is to be a leader of the Arab world, and yet their engagement in the Israeli-Arab conflict, the wars they fought, they paid the heaviest of all prices, and that weakened them. But not only weakened them ultimately economically, but instead of helping enhance their power after 67, it actually made them weaker. Why? Not only because they needed to rebuild, and therefore, if you look at their share of by 1975, more than half of the government budget was going to the military. More than half the government budget was going to the military. Think about that for a minute. But that made them dependent on other Arab states, not leading them. So they need to go beg the Saudis for money. They need to go beg the United Arab Emirates for money. Those countries are going to make demands from them. So the economy was, of course, part of it, but it was part of it in the sense that it affected the distribution of power and the notion of how powerful they are. And they saw the United States providing a strategic umbrella that took them out of the Arab dependence and propelled them into an ascendant strategic position that is tied with their interpretation that the U.S. was the dominant power. We now know that Sadat actually thought the Soviets were going to decline. I mean, he was visionary in that respect. And we talk about glasnost that was brought in the Soviet Union. Sadat was actually the first to use a similar term, infitah, which he used back in, as soon as he came to power. He wanted to open up to the world and saw the future to be with the U.S. So he was figuring that that's going to pull him up economically and then make him more independent. So it was a big package. It wasn't just one thing. Yeah. Yeah, please.
Wait for the microphone.
Thanks for a wonderful talk. And we ask our students to think comparatively, so bridging on George Mitchell to another moment when he was an interlocutor and looking at Northern Ireland. Do you think that Martin McGuinness and Ian Paisley were ahead of their populations, or were their populations with them at that moment?
Good question. Just by the way, I invited George Mitchell before he played this role. Back several years ago, he had written a report on the beginning of the Al-Aqsa Intifada for George W. Bush. He had a report. And right after he did the report, I invited him to come and give my Sadat lecture at the University of Maryland. And I asked him to do exactly that, compare Northern Ireland with the Israel-Palestine question. And that's online if you want to look at it. The lecture is actually posted on sadat.umd.edu. So it's a very good, particularly for high school students, because it's clear, it's intended for broader audience, and it goes for point-by-point comparison. And whether or not George Mitchell was right, of course, is another question, because I think there were huge differences between Northern Ireland and the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, and certainly strategic for sure, but one of the critiques of George Mitchell is that he applied the Northern Ireland model too closely. I'm not sure that he did, but he certainly gave the impression that he did, that he was trying to apply it, that it's all a question of patience and dedication. He used to say, negotiations, you fail for whatever 500 days, and just one day you succeed. So the fact that you keep failing doesn't mean that you're not going to succeed, and that sort of thing. I think people, he and the president, everybody else, underestimated the complexity of the Israel-Palestine question on both sides. I would say principally on the Israeli side, because I think they misinterpreted Israeli politics and what the coalition government wants, and the Israelis, the way Israel read its strategic position and where Benjamin Netanyahu was, but also in some ways misread Mahmoud Abbas, the Palestinian president, because of his political game vis-a-vis Hamas and the competition and his preparedness to compromise. So I think there's just limits to what you can do in comparing the two. Yeah.
I was trying to connect some of the things that were said yesterday to today, and one of the terms that came up, or questions that came up, and this is mainly about the U.S., maybe it's U.S. leadership, or more specifically presidential leadership. So can the U.S. be an ally and a mediator? And as far as maybe the president or his administration goes, related to that, you talked a lot about context and the importance of context. So is that what drives it, or can a president and his administration actually create those windows of opportunity?
Yeah, it's a good question, and that obviously is something that is extremely important, because we had dating back to Camp David between Israel and Egypt, one of the first points of disagreement between Menachem Begin and Anwar Sadat were about the role of the U.S. Menachem Begin wanted the U.S. to be called a mediator. Essentially, you have no independent interest. You're just trying to help us reach an agreement. Sadat wanted the U.S. to be, quote, a partner, and by which he meant, you have strategic interests and you need to bring them to bear. You are interested in a particular kind of agreement. It's not just any agreement that comes between the parties, and you have to weigh in with your own interests. And I think the U.S. Has varied over the years. It's always been committed to Israel. That has never been a question. Some maybe less, you could say, some more committed than others in terms of what how much you're prepared to accept from the Israelis. But if you look at American diplomacy throughout the years, even when we thought there was, quote, pressure applied on Israel, whether it's James Baker putting pressure on Yitzhak Shamir, or Clinton even putting pressure on Netanyahu to bring him to the Wye River negotiations, or any episode of American mediation, when you look at it at the macro level, it was always supportive of Israel. So the bulk of the aid that goes to Israel goes to Israel. The protection of Israel at the UN, again, the employment of the veto power to prevent any international consensus condemning of Israel or changing it, that has never changed, and including in this administration. So the bulk of it is, yes, we are playing the Israel ally, particularly because the Israelis rely on the U.S. Almost entirely, not quite entirely, but they see the U.S. as the main asset globally they have, and they obviously face quite a bit of criticism globally. And yet, the Arabs have always said that you need to be more even-handed. Now, I think what you see over the years is that the U.S. didn't need to be entirely even-handed, never was. But it succeeded, and sometimes it failed at others. And I think the degree to which it shows sensitivity with the other side is very important. Bill Clinton started off not having the confidence of the Arabs at all. Bill Clinton used to be called the biggest supporter of Israel in the history of the United States. You look back at he was loved in Israel, particularly after the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin, where he was tied to his legacy in some ways. But always trusted, always supported. To this day, he goes to Israel, he's like a rock star. I mean, Bill Clinton is loved in Israel. And yet, despite his seeming, taking sides with Israel, he managed at one point to get Palestinian confidence. they saw him as being pro-Israel, but they thought he learned enough and cared enough to want to take them into account. And I think that you need someone who can convey that, even as you're still being supportive. I don't think the U.S. will ever be fully even-handed on this issue. I just don't think so. I think it's sort of part of America's body politics is this Israeli-American relationship, and I think whatever. So you have to figure out then how do you weigh in effectively, given that that's an axiom of American foreign policy.
I'll take the last question. I think we're about to run out of time. During the 1948 war, there was a ship called the Altalena that was delivering arms to Begin's faction.
Right.
And Ben-Gurion blew it up.
Right.
Because he wanted to underscore the point that there had to be
Right.
one army.
Right.
And now, in the case of the Palestinians, it's not just that Hamas is a political competitor, it's its own army. So how can there be a peace with the Palestinians until Hamas is somehow taken care of by the Palestinians?
Well, remember that the Hamas problem, as a problem that emerged, is in terms of control of Gaza, is relatively recent. We still didn't have peace before that, and Mahmoud Abbas, whatever you say about him, and he's like any leader, a flawed leader, and you can say that there are things that he did right and things that he did wrong. But one thing he did do from the very beginning, and really dating back even to Camp David, it just basically said, if we're engaged in a peace process and we're in the West Bank and Gaza and we're negotiating with the Israelis, we cannot activate military violence as an instrument of policy. And he went against Yasser Arafat on this in 2000 when the negotiations failed, the Intifada emerged, and Arafat himself decided to embrace it, or at least acquiesce in it, as something that would be helpful. And he's been very much decisive in that regard. And there were times when, even while Arafat was there, and he became prime minister, where there were opportunities for the U.S. to empower him and the Israelis to respond to him. And it never happened. Now, it's not all entirely everybody else's fault. As I said, it's a complicated picture. But I think at some point you have to say, there is a body politic in Israel that hasn't been exactly forthcoming in terms of wanting to pull out of the West Bank or reaching a two-state solution. And that is a big part of the problem, particularly that's where the power is, far more than the Palestinians.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you.